coming up next on 60 Minutes.
That seatbelt light went on and then we were just thrown straight in the air, bounced off the ceiling.
Terror at 37,000 feet.
People screaming, injuries, blood.
One passenger dead and dozens severely injured.
Hearing a man ask, "Can you feel your legs?" No, can't feel that.
But could this catastrophe
All these aeroplanes changing direction.
have been avoided?
Here comes SQ321 on a straight line.
We call that a smoking gun.
Hello and welcome to Extra Minutes, the 60 Minutes podcast. I'm Adam Hegarty and I have the pleasure to be joined by retired and veteran pilot Richard Woodward. Richard, good to chat to you again.
Thanks, Adam.
Richard was a big part of our investigation on 60 Minutes into Singapore Airlines flight SQ321 and the turbulence it struck. Richard has helped us break down that analysis. You can see that story on 9 Now, as well as our YouTube channel. Richard, anyone who's seen that story, and really anyone in the aftermath of what happened to Singapore Airlines flight SQ321, would understandably be a bit concerned about air travel. Is modern day air travel safe?
Oh, it absolutely is. It's safer than any other form of travel by a large factor. In fact, statistics are not good things to use, but you'd have to sit in an aeroplane for about 1,500 years to guarantee to be in an accident.
It's that old saying, isn't it, that you're more likely to be in an accident driving to the airport than when you're actually in the air? That still stands.
I think in Australia there's a 1 in 200,000 chance of dying in your own bathroom. So yes, it's more dangerous to drive your car or be in your bathroom than it is to get in an aeroplane.
Yeah, but Richard, statistics are one thing and they're certainly accurate, but what's so terrifying about what happened on SQ321 is it was extreme turbulence that led to one death and severe injuries that came out of nowhere with little to no warning.
True.
Doesn't that show that maybe air travel is a bit dangerous and could be really sadly unlucky for people in that situation?
Oh, look, there's never been a death in flight if you're wearing your seatbelt in turbulence. Never. So, yes, the aeroplanes bump into turbulence, but there is no way known that it's got more dangerous. In fact, there's millions of people airborne at any 1 hour of the day. It's an amazing form of transport around the planet.
And you're right, everyone that was injured on this flight wasn't wearing their seatbelt, but the cruel thing about it is, Kerry Jordan, for instance, and her partner Keith, breakfast was being served. So crew were up with the trolleys. So they've gone up, gone to the bathroom, and then the seatbelt light's only gone 8 seconds before it hit. They really didn't have much time, right, to actually get back into their seat and put their seatbelt on. We know Kerry tried to.
Yeah, it wasn't very long, and I'm not sure why it was so short a time. Normally, they were doing meal service, so that makes life difficult. But if you're prepared for turbulence, you strap everyone in long before you get near it and you tell the crew to sit down. You take a lot of precautions if you're going to have to go through turbulence.
So what happened, do you think, on this flight that might dispel some fears that people might have about air travel? Because it still happened, and this is something that could have happened to any of us in that instance. We all get up and go to the bathroom on a flight.
That's true. My only word of advice to anyone who's intending to fly an aeroplane is if you're sitting down, wear your seatbelt. You don't have to wear it tight, but you need to wear it permanently. Now, we can't legislate to do that. There's people around the world thinking about doing that. But, you wouldn't travel in a car these days without having your seatbelt on, so take the same attitude to an aeroplane. Wear your seatbelt.
What our analysis has looked into is what kind of turbulence it was struck, and the new evidence suggests that it was a storm that the pilots flew into or near. The fact that that's the instance in this case, does that mean that it's a better outcome in terms of the safety of air travel because this was something that could have been avoided as opposed to some insidious threat where they couldn't have recognised what they were heading into?
Oh, I'm not sure about that, but the thunderstorms occur around the world every day. There's anywhere between 1,500 and 2,000 active storms any second of the day around the world, so they're prevalent. And I think I explained to you in the other program that there's a huge amount of energy in a thunderstorm, equivalent of a nuclear weapon, basically. So we go out of our way to avoid them. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you've got to penetrate a line of storms. So what you do there is, as I said, you strap people in, you shut everything down, and you go through the least line of resistance, the bit on the radar that doesn't look red. You go through the green bits if you can.
Well, it's an obvious thing, isn't it? So that's something that pilots every day, millions are travelling each day, you're always avoiding these thunderstorms, these weather events in pretty much every flight that you fly?
Yeah, well, the world's air meets in the middle around the equator. It goes up at the equator and then comes down at the poles, and it's a big circulation. And where they meet in the equator, the air rushes up and it's very turbulent. It builds big storms and it moves north or south according to the season. And that area of the world is known for having thunderstorms. It's called the Intertropical Convergence Zone. Don't worry about the technical name, but it just means where all the air masses in the world are bumping into each other. And that inevitably has storms and weather in it as it moves north and south. It's responsible for the wet season in northern Australia. It's responsible for the monsoon season in India and places like that. It just moves around. We have to cross that if we're going somewhere.
So what happens to a plane if it goes through one of these storms?
Oh, planes are incredibly strong. The external structure of the aeroplane is designed for those sort of rigours. In fact, well beyond what a storm can generate. There's never been an aircraft structurally fail due to thunderstorms. Unfortunately, internally, lots of the internal fittings will come loose. They're not held on in near what the outside of the aeroplane is. So, yes, you saw some things in the galleys and fall down, and some of the baggage lockers come open, etc.
But then passengers go flying. I mean, the plane might be built to withstand this, but the human body isn't.
No, well, the human body, you're sitting in it. If you're not strapped in, you're just a loose object. And if it's going down or up at an incredible rate, you're either going with it, or if it's falling, you're not going with it, you're staying effectively where you are in space, and the only thing that stops you is the roof.
Yeah. So the forces exerted on those passengers in that flight, when you heard about it, what did you think the plane flew near?
Well, the aeroplane suffered a fairly strong updraft and then closely followed by a really strong downdraft. Now, my first thought was that could only occur in or near a thunderstorm, because thunderstorms are caused by massive updrafts closely followed by giant downdrafts as the water gets too heavy that it's holding up millions of kilograms of water, starts falling earthwards. That's why we get intense rain. So it pretty well, to my case, had to be a thunderstorm.
Yeah, so something arguably the pilots should have recognised or should have avoided. That's a possible situation here, that maybe something was missed or not picked up?
Oh, I'm sure they were trying to avoid the weather. We looked at the weather over Myanmar and there was quite a deal of thunderstorms because of what I just said. And there were aeroplanes going everywhere trying to avoid the weather. Now, I don't know what the Singapore Airlines pilots were thinking, but it must have been a fairly benign-looking radar picture, and they probably thought we could go straight ahead. And they got caught out by a growing storm. It seems as if that's the case. I can't prove that, and wouldn't like to claim it in a court of law unless there's more evidence.
Could have just been incredibly unlucky. And if that's the case, that's pretty frightening for passengers, isn't it? To think that they might be in a situation like that where it can just sort of pop up and not be avoided?
Well, you can't guarantee absolute luck in all these circumstances, but you go out of your way as a professional crew to avoid putting yourself in that situation. So as I said, I'm not sure why they hit a cell that was climbing, a thunderstorm that was climbing. Normally you would go out of your way, even up to 100 miles, 200 plus kilometres to avoid weather. They're known terrible things, thunderstorms. They're bad for the passengers and the internal sides of the airplane. We know that.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, what are pilots able to see on a radar or the naked eye to try and avoid these thunderstorms?
Well, radars are only good at seeing water. The radar beam hits the water droplet and bounces back. That's what causes the radar reflection. If there's no water, there's no reflection. So you would get a varying intensity of radar picture. If it's fairly benign, it'll be green, and if it gets more intense, it's yellow. It ultimately comes red and magenta, and if it's that's a measure of the amount of water it's seeing. If you see red or magenta, don't fly in red or magenta bits. Also, if it's a lovely sunny day, you can look out the window and see these things developing. So you can see the radar picture, but you can also look out the window and go out of your way to avoid the things.
But we just don't know why that wasn't done in this case?
No, there's many reasons why that might have been the case, one of which is if you're turning the aeroplane around one thunderstorm and another one appears behind it, you may not be able to avoid it. The aeroplane is doing about 15 kilometres a minute, 8 nautical miles a minute. It's going fairly fast. And the turn radius, the amount it takes to turn the aeroplane around something, is about 6.4 mile, about 12 or 13 kilometres. So if you see something that's in front of you 4 or 5 kilometres away, you can start the turn, but the aeroplane will fly through it. So I can't say categorically why they couldn't avoid that storm, but they the storms grow really fast. They grow up underneath you very quickly, and you've got to use the radar to look down below you as well as straight ahead.
Well, clearly a lot of training goes into it, and these would have been really experienced pilots for Singapore Airlines. What would you say to passengers who fly Singapore Airlines quite frequently, or any reputable airline, because they know that they're really experienced and trained pilots who you would think would be able to avoid a situation like this?
Oh, look, Singapore Airlines is a very good carrier. There's world-class carriers. They're a world-class carrier. So it was an unfortunate circumstance. It might have been a miscalculation. It just might have been a piece of bad luck you alluded to, that they ran into something. I can't criticise the pilots because I wasn't sitting on the flight deck, but there were other aeroplanes going a long way out of their way to avoid that area of weather.
The initial reports after this incident was that it was something known as clear air turbulence. Can you just explain the difference there between what we now believe and the evidence shows likely happened here at being a forming thunderstorm, and how that's different to what was portrayed as clear air turbulence?
Clear air turbulence is where two air masses bump into each other. They could be caused by a thermal gradient, a difference in temperature in the upper atmosphere, or they could be caused by a cold air mass hitting a warm air mass, or just upwelling over say, a giant mountain like somewhere in Iran or even New Zealand, for instance. They're fairly high mountains. And you get a rotor circulation, and they form quite big bumps, and you can end up with a thing called a jet stream, which, if you imagine, is a giant river of air that flows around the planet. And they're typically about the mid-latitude. So, for instance, here in Australia, in winter, there's a jet stream over southern Australia. It passes all the way over West Australia, all over Sydney, and out over the Pacific. Now, in summer, as that massive warm tropical air I mentioned earlier moves further south, they move south, and they move south of Australia. So if you're in the middle of that giant river of air, it's reasonably smooth, but it's going very fast. It's doing up to 300 kilometres an hour or more. So if you're going one way, it helps your speed. So, for instance, if those people have come from Perth to Sydney, they'll realise the flight time's, pick a figure, 3 hours. You're going the other way, it's 4 and a bit hours, because the poor old aeroplane's heading into 300 kilometre hour winds. So, but on the periphery of that giant river of air, you can get clear air turbulence, where the very fast moving air is mixing with the slow moving air, and you can get quite extreme turbulence. Can the radar see it? No.
Well, that's scary, isn't it? If the radar can't see it, these are things that any airlines, passenger jets in the air right now could fly into, and it could wreak havoc in the cabin, similar to what we saw on SQ321?
Possibly, but forecasting is very good these days. Met forecasting around the world is very, very good, particularly for aviation, and it's updated regularly. So the pilots who are going somewhere will get information where there's potential turbulence in an area, and they'll go out of their way to avoid it, or they might cruise at a lower altitude. Or if they have to go and do it, they'll slow down to what's called the turbulence penetration speed of the aeroplane, and as I said, cease all meal services and do things like that. And if they're a professional company like Singapore Airlines, there would be updates sent to the crew via a data link system, and they would get weather updates. And the other good thing is there's hundreds of airplanes flying, so someone in front of you will say, I've just run into turbulence, and that would be broadcast to everyone around them, and they'd know there's turbulence. I came out of the United States years ago, and there was severe turbulence all over the southern United States, severe turbulence. I cruised at 24,000 feet, way below normal cruise altitude, until I just about to leave the coast of America. Did I get any bumps? No.
So that communication is really important, either for towers or other planes in the air at the time, to avoid these quite insidious threats when you're referring to clear air turbulence.
Yeah, we have to help each other. There's no mechanism currently of defining where it is and what it is. As I said, radars depend on the water moisture, droplets, in other words. In clear air, it may be completely dry, and it's mixing air very fast. So there's some technologies they're trying, things called a LIDAR. It's a light detection system. It's basically a laser they point out the front of the aircraft. And the problem is it's very short range at the moment. And funnily enough, it still relies on things in the atmosphere, and typically dust. They're very good around certain airfields. Hong Kong airfield, for instance, has got a LIDAR system that looks at the wind being stirred up over the top of the nearby islands. It's very dusty. The LIDAR sees that very well and can give a forecast that you're going to encounter turbulence or wind shear. There's other things like Doppler radars they're working on, but there is no modern system that is in an aeroplane that can see clear air turbulence.
Are you convinced and sure that this wasn't clear air turbulence, what SQ321 encountered?
Oh, it's very rare to see clear air turbulence of that severity in the tropical zones. I mentioned the air coming up and going down. Typically, you see clear air turbulence further away from the equator, where it could be caused by giant mountains, as I mentioned, air flowing over mountains. It could be just the jet streams mixing. It could be just a cold front pushing a hot front up. It could be a huge temperature gradient caused by strong hot air coming off off the deserts. So I'm 90% certain it wasn't clear air turbulence as we know it.
Would clear air turbulence create the kind of forces we saw on that Singapore Airlines flight?
It can do.
So they could be just as severe as a thunderstorm?
Oh, yes. Really bad clear air turbulence is very bad. It's every bit extreme or severe. It meets the same criteria. And if you don't get warned about it and you run into it, you've got very little notice and you've got to turn the seatbelt on and tell everyone to sit down immediately because it's boom, you're in it. And you don't know it's there unless someone's gone there before you and said it's really turbulent up here.
Yeah. So how important is that then? If you've got all these threats up there, either clear air turbulence or thunderstorms, if there's some sort of communication breakdown among pilots or the towers where you could hit these things, how frequently up there?
There's been a bunch of research done that says clear air turbulence or turbulence encounters per se are increasing around the world. There's one university published a paper on that. I'm not sure that they've covered all the confounding variables, as we say, about whether they've been encountered more often. I think they said that the severe turbulence encounters were up 57%, but they're only looking at the North Atlantic, which is a very busy air route. We cross the Pacific, and the Pacific's a giant lump of water and giant lump of air, and you may never see turbulence crossing that for hundreds of times, then you might bump into it. It's just a bit unpredictable. Crews are trained to deal with it. The aeroplane's strong enough to deal with it. It's just exceptionally bad luck to run into something and not know it's there.
Well, what would you say to passengers then who look at this and see that there's some sort of mistake that's happened for this plane to have flown into a thunderstorm, and then on top of that there's this notion of clear air turbulence around there? Clearly something's happened in that instance. So how can people be confident that wouldn't happen again?
Well, you can never be absolutely confident in anything. So moral of the story is wear your seatbelt. If you're sitting in your seat, wear your seatbelt. It doesn't have to be tight. It just has to be on.
That's hard though, isn't it? I mean, everyone has to get up and go to the bathroom and stretch their legs. I mean, this was a long-haul flight from London. I mean, we all have to get up at some point, and then there was no warning. So what does that tell us about having to stay in our seats? Do we not go up and go to the bathroom anymore?
No, I'd prefer you to get up and go to the bathroom, because then you can get a thing called deep vein thrombosis, which is guaranteed to be worse for you than a bit of turbulence.
Well, but perhaps not if you're in a situation like this, right? I mean, it's a scary thought.
It's the safest mode of transport on the planet, Adam, by a long, long factor. The next safest mode of transport is high-speed trains, funnily enough, but aviation is infinitely safer than any other form of transport on the planet.
Well, tell me this. Have you ever seen anything like what happened to SQ321 in terms of the turbulence hit without warning and the serious injuries sustained?
No, not personally, not in my career. I've encountered severe turbulence. I've had to take off out of Tokyo and climb through a cyclone. I've had severe turbulence out of Hong Kong because of the surrounding terrain. And there's been the odd one around Guam in the Pacific because there's giant thunderstorms, and I was miles from the thunderstorms, but it was still very bumpy. But I've never, in my entire career, seen anyone injured in my aircraft as a result of turbulence. And it's not because I'm a superhero, it's just because people who travel a lot realise they've got to wear a seatbelt, and the crews are being very professional. They're going out of their way to avoid the weather if they can.
Do you think anything might be improved broadly in terms of air travel and how pilots communicate on the back of what's found to have caused this case?
Oh, there's a move afoot. Apart from the technology I mentioned earlier, there's a move afoot that aeroplanes have a thing called an onboard recorder of various types. They're called flight data recorders. There's a whole bunch of names for different types. Quick access recorders. The aeroplane's recording hundreds and hundreds of parameters, engines and turbulence and speed and position. And there's a move afoot to get that information linked through a satellite to the aeroplanes in the area. So if you bumped into turbulence, your aeroplane would tell everyone in your immediate area that you've hit this type of turbulence. And because the aeroplane records how much it is, it'll tell everyone the severity of it and where you are. That's coming, and that will be very much a boon to aviation. It'll be real-time, aeroplanes near you telling them what they've encountered.
Maybe ease the nerves of a few prospective passengers off the back of what's happened to Singapore Airlines here.
Well, I don't want passengers to be alarmed. I get your point that there are concerns, but I spent my entire career flying aeroplanes. I've had to say to the odd passenger, do you think I'd do this job if it was unsafe? I'm sitting closer to the accident or the turbulence than you are. I'm sitting up the front. And the amount of times we hit turbulence versus the amount of flying that's done worldwide is minuscule. It's not nice for Kerry and her partner because she's severely injured. And I feel sympathy for people who have that problem. I feel a lot of sympathy for Kerry. It's just an unfortunate set of circumstances occurred there. It sounds terrible, but it is. There are about 1 million people airborne at any 1 second of the day in the moment around the planet, and they're travelling successfully without getting injured.
Not a bad point to end on. Richard, thank you for your time. And again, you can catch our investigation into Singapore Airlines flight SQ321 and the turbulence it hit on 9Now and our YouTube channel.